Rebecca, and thank you to the WRI for the opportunity to speak here today, and thank you for everyone for coming along online. It's a real pleasure to be here and give this presentation. So I'll just start sharing my screen, and hopefully you will all be able to see some slides. Okay, so yeah, as Rebecca said, my talk today, a bit of a play on word, two tales of a city. And so today's seminar is perhaps a little bit different from the kind of seminar that I might usually give, because I'm focusing on agriculture, but agriculture in more of a city-based way. And so this might be the sort of typical soil ecologist view of the world. And I give a lot of these seminars. Here we've got an agricultural field. In this case, it's a tomato field, processing tomatoes. We're doing a drought trial in this case. And we might go out there and we collect some soil cores very carefully. And we might look at the microbiomes, all the microbes that are present in that soil core. And then we might measure some ecosystem processes and services that are provided by those microbes, and then try and relate that back to the management of that particular agricultural system. And so that's the sort of very classical TIM type seminar that I might give. But what I wanted to do today was to try and present something a little bit different. So if we take this farmer's field here where we've got tomatoes, what you'll also see in the background are some trees. Okay, so we've got some environmental plantings on this particular farm, where the farm is being managed in a way that's not only to produce food and fibre and fuel, but it's also about growing trees and providing habitat and biodiversity on the farm as well. And so that's the context for the first part of work around Carbon Neutral Adelaide. And then the second half of the seminar, I'm going to talk about quite different agricultural systems, urban agricultural systems. And as you can see in the slide here, this is not necessarily what you immediately think of when you think about agriculture. But hopefully I can make the case that these are really interesting. They're obviously very diverse agricultural systems, and they're also potentially quite significant agricultural systems as well. So when I talk about Carbon Neutral Adelaide, what I'm really talking about here is sequestration of carbon on agricultural lands. So as a way of mitigating atmospheric CO2, we can effectively manage the soil in particular ways to sequester carbon in the soil, or we can plant vegetation as well to capture that carbon in the biomass of the plants, but also then to have that carbon build up and accrue in the soil. So when I talk about an environmental planting, it's this kind of situation. We've got a grazing property here, you've got a pasture, and then we've got this environmental planting. This particular one's a mixed species woody planting is how we would call it. And you can see in the foreground, we've got a casuarina, we've got an acacia here, we've got eucalypts. And so there are mixtures of these different perennial trees in this system. This work was funded by the Goiter Institute, and I'd like to thank and acknowledge them for supporting this work. And this was really a very multidisciplinary cross-institutional effort. So there were partners from the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia. And it was multidisciplinary in the sense that we were looking very much at the biophysical, the technical carbon supply, but also looking at the economics of that. And so the real work in the project was done by Claire Setter and David Summers at Adelaide, who did the technical carbon supply and the co-benefits work. And they're pictured down here in the bottom of the slide, and Courtney Regan from UniSA, who did the economics. So he's also pictured down here on the slide. Other collaborators in the project team were Patrick O'Connor, who I'm sure many of you will know, and Andy Lowe as well, and Jeff Connor from UniSA. And there are a host of other collaborators from various government agencies as well. So what's Carbon Neutral Adelaide? What's this all about? So South Australia has a climate change strategy, 2015 to 2050, towards a low carbon economy. And this is a really interesting document. I looked at the forward of the document, and it says from the strategy, climate change provides South Australia with one of the biggest economic opportunities of the 21st century. While global warming presents significant challenges for the state, taking ambitious and early action can position us to maximise this opportunity. So that's a really interesting take on climate change. Clearly, we're acknowledging the fact that this is a major challenge in an environmental sense, but it also represents an opportunity for the state as well. Because if we take ambitious and early action, we can maximise this opportunity. And so to realise these benefits, we need to be bold, and that's why they've said that by 2050, South Australia will have net zero emissions. And so that's a really good target to go for. If we then look at Carbon Neutral Adelaide. There's a Carbon Neutral Adelaide Action Plan 2016 to 2021. And directly from this report, it's saying in 2015, the state government and Adelaide City Council committed to a joint aspiration for Adelaide to be the world's first carbon neutral city. And so I think that's a fantastic goal and one that we should be very proud of. It then goes on to say we signed a sector agreement to formalise that collaboration and released a shared vision document that outlined our direction and priorities for pursuing our goal. And it was really that action plan that led to the Goiter work on trying to answer the question, how do we achieve a carbon neutral Adelaide? And so there are 104 different actions that have been set out under 5 different key emission reduction pathways that will take us along this journey towards carbon neutrality. And so if we look at those different pathways, here we've got the carbon neutral Adelaide on the right-hand side, and these wedges on the left-hand side show the kinds of actions that we need to take to achieve carbon neutrality. So energy efficient built forms, so that's about buildings and infrastructure, zero emission transport, renewable energy, reduced emissions from waste and water, and offset carbon emissions. And so what I'm focusing on today is offsetting the carbon emissions. So we can do a lot to reduce our emissions, but there will still be emissions that need to be offset. And so that's really what the focus of this project is about. And those offsets are quite substantial. This is some modelling that was done, not by us, but it was done by Houston in 2015. And it shows along the x-axis our progression towards 2050 and trying to achieve carbon neutrality, which is effectively what the y-axis is showing us. And you can see that carbon forestry, so effectively growing trees, is a really significant part of the plan. We can achieve energy efficiency and reduce our emissions, but we still need that carbon forestry offset as well. And so again, that's where we were trying to focus our efforts. So how do you offset carbon emissions? Well, it's pretty easy, right? You grow some trees or you change the way in which you manage your soils. Fortunately, the federal government through the emissions reduction framework have put out this handy guide that's very simple to follow. As you can see, there's a whole host of different actions that you might take, and there's a pathway diagram here to decide whether or not that's the approach that you can take for your particular land use context. Really, to kind of summarize that in a very simple way, the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Framework in one sentence, says do approved things to increase or avoid the imminent loss of carbon, and you either need to model or measure it. So the idea here is you need to do something that's approved underneath this framework, and then you need to model that carbon that's sequestered, or you need to measure it directly. So it's about taking action on land and having some sort of accountability, some way of reporting on that. So the first thing that we needed to do when we're thinking about where could we offset carbon emissions in South Australia was to determine the technical carbon supply. And to do that, you need to know where you can undertake approved ERF activities. So certain activities under the ERF can only be undertaken in certain contexts, for example, rainfall and so on. And so the first exercise here was to take our map of South Australia and then identify where you could undertake different ERF activities. And so you can see here, for example, environmental plantings and revegetation. So this is, as it sounds like, it's growing trees. That can be undertaken in a large portion of the state. Okay, that's covered in green there. Whereas if we look at, say, something like a shift from short run to long run forest conversion, so that's all about how you manage forests, the eligible areas are largely where we see forestry in South Australia, so down here in the southeast, and also a little bit here as well. And of course, there are other different methods that we can use under the ERF, and so we mapped all of those out. There's some around mallee revegetation, some around soil conservation and management, and so on. So we now know where we can undertake these different activities within South Australia. The next step was to then determine how much carbon would be sequestered if you undertook those practice changes. And so as part of the ERF, there's a model called FullCam, and FullCam allows you to model how much carbon would be sequestered under the different ERF activities. So we took our map of South Australia and then we laid out a 10-kilometre grid. So every 10 kilometres, we placed a point on the map in South Australia, and then we used the FullCam model in the ERF uses to build a curve that talks about the sequestration of carbon at each of those individual points. And so just to give you a sense, this is no small task. If you think about taking a point every 10 kilometres across a large portion of South Australia and then running it through this model, and this is a manual exercise, you need to enter the latitude and longitude, you can then build these curves. But what that does is it gives you the technical carbon supply. It tells you how much carbon will be sequestered at that particular location under a different type of land use change. And so what that provides for each and every site along that 10 by 10 kilometre grid is one of these sequestration curves. And so what we've got here is time on the x-axis, and then you can see the solid line shows the annual sequestration and the dashed line shows the cumulative sequestration. So if you think about, you have say a pasture and you plant some trees on that pasture, the trees grow very quickly early on and then their growth rate decreases, and you get a cumulative carbon sequestration curve that looks something like this. So that tells you how much carbon is going to be sequestered in tons of CO2 equivalent. And so you can generate those curves for each and every point on the map. You can also generate those curves for each and every ERF method that can be undertaken at that particular location. So we can do that at the individual site scale, or we can also enter that into our map. And what you can see here is with the darker colors, we're getting more carbon sequestered through sustainable intensification and less carbon sequestered with the lighter colors on the map. So you can look at individual sites, or you can generate a map for the state as well. So that gives a sense of what we call the technical carbon supply, how much carbon could be supplied at the site and the state level. And then this is where the economists come into play. And I will remind everyone at this point that I'm a microbial ecologist, not an economist. So I'll do my best to explain the economics. With our map of South Australia, with our 10 by 10 kilometre grid, we also have land use data, but we have economic data. So we know what farming, agricultural practices are undertaken there, and we know something about the cost of those activities and the margins associated with those. We then know the cost that it takes to undertake a particular change in practice towards a carbon sequestration activity. And when you put those two pieces of information together and look at the opportunity cost, you can look at the price that the carbon price needs to be for someone to make a switch from their current land practice to a carbon farming practice, right? At what point does it become more lucrative to go into carbon farming than the current farming activities? And so what we found here, we've got our curve for South Australia over various carbon crediting periods. I won't get into that now. And we can also convert that into a map for the whole state. So the higher carbon price required is the darker colours, the lower carbon price required are the lower colours. The point is here that the first carbon supply occurs at a carbon price of $38 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. So it's at that point when you will see the first shift from business as usual into carbon sequestration activities. That's where it becomes economically viable. And that's, yeah, at $38 a tonne. You can look at this in a number of different ways. So here we've zoomed into the southeast and we're looking at environmental plantings, for example, and these different colours tell you the carbon price that you need to have in order for people to make that shift. So the green colours, the light green colour rather, is at $50 a tonne. This is where it becomes more viable to undertake the carbon sequestration activities through environmental plantings, whereas up here in this sort of olive green colour, you need a price at about $100 a tonne. We've done similar modelling, obviously, for other regions as well. So this is environmental plantings in the YP and in the north as well, the mid-north. And you can see, again, where the areas where you would first start to see a transition towards environmental plantings away from business as usual. So when you look at all of that, it boils down to a pretty simple story. Accounting for all establishment and opportunity costs, the first economically viable supply occurs at $38 per tonne of CO2 equivalent sequestered. And at that price point across South Australia, we would see an abatement of 9.3 megatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. If you increase the carbon price to $50 a tonne, there's a substantial increase in the uptake, and you'd see 130 megatons of CO2 equivalent abatement. So simply by increasing the price by $12, we would go from 9 to 130 megatons of CO2 equivalent sequestered. The key point here is that the average carbon prices under the most recent ERF auctions are at $12 a tonne. Okay, so in South Australia, we're not going to see economically viable uptake until we hit $38 a tonne. and the current price is $12 a tonne, which is well below what would be required to stimulate economically viable carbon plantings. And I have to say the Australian carbon price is quite low compared to the rest of the world. This also explains why in the 6 or 7 rounds of the ERF auctions that have occurred to date, there's been very little uptake in South Australia as well. Okay, so how do we get this thing over the line? How do we make it more economically viable for people to undertake these kinds of practice changes? And this is where we can start to think about what we call co-benefits. So when you plant trees in the landscape, yes, you get carbon sequestered and you can get $12 a tonne for that from the ERF, but there are also other benefits that come about from planting trees in the landscape. And you can put an economic value on those different activities. And when you start to add those benefits together, you can start to increase the return on those activities and they become more economically viable. And so that's the next part of the work that we looked at. And so one of the examples here is shelter belts. So here we've got a fairly typical grazing farm. This one was sheep were on this particular property. And what you can see is we've got the farmer's field here with a nice pasture, but they've also planted these environmental plantings, right? They've fenced off part of their field and they've planted trees. And so those trees provide shelter to the sheep, to the livestock, right? Because when the wind comes in and the rain comes in, it's cold, this provides some sort of physical barrier, and that has a real benefit to the livestock. So this is a figure that's showing the wind chill x-axis on wind chill on the x-axis and mortality on the y-axis. And what this basically says is as the temperature gets cooler, as the wind chill index increases, you get greater mortality in sheep, right? So this is, we're talking about lambs here. It differs whether you're talking about merinos or whether you're talking about crossbeds. And the other point I want to make here is it differs whether you're talking about a ewe that has a single lamb or multiple lambs. Okay, so the mortality rate tends to be higher where you have twins compared to where you have single lambs per ewe. Okay, so what we can do is we take a map of South Australia and we can look at the monthly average wind chill. So as you might predict, wind chill is higher in the cooler months of the year, May, June, July, August. It's much lower in the summer months as you'd expect. So we know when it's cooler and we know when the wind chill is higher and we know where the wind chill is at its highest. We also know that at about 950 kilojoules per metre squared per hour is a critical number for mortality in lambs or in livestock with wind chill. And so what we've done on this series of maps here is we've taken the wind chill data and then we've calculated the probability of areas exceeding that 950, that magic number of 950. And so what we're effectively saying here is where it's red, there's a very, very high probability that you will exceed that wind chill number that's of concern. Where it's a light blue color, say here in January, you're not going to have a very high probability of that occurring. And as you'd kind of predict, if we look in July, we're going to have higher wind chills, and the cooler parts of the state tend to have greater higher wind chills. So in the Mount Lofty Ranges, up in the mid-north, down in the southeast, and on Kangaroo Island as well. Okay, so now we know where and when it's likely to be chilly, and that's likely to be a problem for livestock. What we then did is we ran a bunch of scenario modeling exercises where we looked at different scenarios in terms of optimistic, realistic, and pessimistic outcomes in terms of wind chill effects on the livestock. And then we looked at different scenarios for the rates of twins that are born to a particular ewe. So from 30%, 50%, and 80% twins. Okay, so quite a wide range of scenarios there. And what we found is that higher carbon prices than in the ERF are required for economic value from shelter belt carbon and land mortality reduction. And that was for most of the scenarios and locations considered. However, for some regions, it was actually quite a viable proposition. So in the high rainfall southeast, Adelaide and the Mount Lofty Ranges, with a moderate assumption of land mortality and 50% twin litter rates, optimistic shelter effectiveness assumptions, effectively, we saw a break-even point at $15 to $16 per tonne of CO2 equivalent sequestered. So where the current ERF price is at $12, this is starting to become viable at about $15. So you can start to see how when you bring in these other benefits, these co-benefits, you can become more economically viable. All that has to happen is for the price to go up a few dollars, and suddenly this becomes a very sensible thing to do. Okay. The other point, and this is really, really important, is there are many other co-benefits. So we're getting close to viability here when we talk about shelter belts and we talk about the carbon. But if you start to value these other co-benefits like biodiversity, water quality, amenity value, there's land values, there's a whole host of other benefits. And when you stack those together, then we can start to make the case for these changes in land use practice. Okay, so that's a strange slide, isn't it? There's a cupcake. Carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration, I think of it a little bit like a cupcake. Okay, bear with me. When I think about a cupcake, the cake is the current system. This is what we're currently doing. But as we all know, cupcakes, the cake itself is really just a vehicle for delivering the icing. Okay, and the icing is about the carbon sequestration activities. And so I would suggest that all of the co-benefits that you might accrue from undertaking these carbon sequestration activities, you might think of them as the co-benefits, right? All those other benefits that you get from undertaking those activities. And the payment that you get from the ERF is really just the cherry on top, right? That $12 is actually relatively small compared to the economic value of all of those other co-benefits that you might achieve through undertaking carbon sequestration activities. Okay, so that's a very quick run through the Adelaide carbon neutral work that we were doing. What I want to do now is shift directions and start talking about urban agriculture. And this is an area that I've been interested in for a number of years. And the work I'm going to present today is really the work of two students. So Matt Salomon, who's a PhD student, who's pictured down here, and Isabel Hume, who undertook honours in the group and has now gone on to do a PhD to continue her work in this area as well. And co-supervisors, in addition to me, are Steph Watts-Fawkes, Mike McLaughlin, and David Summers. Okay, so urban agriculture, it's shown in this image here. I think this is a really nice image. This is from a garden in Glenelg. It's a community garden. You can see we're obviously next to a park or something here, but there's also residential housing around this particular location. So these are farms that really are in suburbia. And when I look at this, I see a huge amount of diversity, right? The crops that are being grown, the way in which they're being grown, these are very, very diverse systems. And that actually makes them really interesting from a management perspective. Okay, so that's the picture. What is urban agriculture? Urban agriculture is the practice of cultivating and producing food in urban areas. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about plants, but we can also be talking about animals and other food stuff as well. We can be talking about private and public land. So it might be in someone's backyard, it might be a community garden, it might be on a roadside verge. Okay, there's one in the Adelaide parklands that you may or may not be aware of, right? They're all around Adelaide when you go looking for them. The purpose is that they might be for consumption, so the gardener might produce food for their own purposes, but they might also be for distribution and sale. And so we found a number of commercial enterprises on effectively residential blocks that were producing food and selling it at, for example, farmers markets. And of course, urban agriculture can take place in, around, under, or on top of urban infrastructure. So it's not just necessarily in backyards, but it might be on rooftops, or it might be under buildings, it might be in them, it might be around them. So it's an incredibly diverse farming system. We've largely focused on the outdoor systems and soil-based systems. Okay, so it's also becoming an increasingly popular topic. I looked on the ABC webpage last week when I was putting this seminar together, and in the last month or so, I found 3 stories. First one, city farming on rise as COVID-19 makes people rethink how they source their food. So that was a week or so ago. Food suburbs, urban farms in every neighborhood creates close communities. So this is one from earlier this year. What's really interesting here is when you think about urban agriculture, yes, you're producing food and you're using the land in that way, but there's a whole host of other benefits as well, a whole bunch of social benefits that accrue because you get that community interaction. It's really quite an interesting nexus between science, the hard sciences, and the biophysical sciences and social sciences and so on. This was a story recently on Gardening Australia where Costa went out and he met with someone who's growing quite a lot of food on their balcony in the middle of Sydney. All right, so this is something that people are quite interested in at the moment. Urban agriculture also is facing some really significant challenges. So it was about 2015, there was a major change in the world, and that change was where people live. So prior to 2015, the majority of the world's people lived in rural areas. But from 2015 onwards, there was a shift to the city where that balance changed. So now more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. So people have moved away from their rural areas, and that's had a whole host of consequences. It's disconnected them from their food supply. There's supply chain issues. There's a whole bunch of things which this audience is obviously very well aware of about people in connection to their food. If you look at the data from 1950 and then projections up to 2050, and these come from the UN and the FAO. If you look at Australia, it's a pretty familiar story that the majority of our population lives in urban areas, has done so for a long time, and will continue to do so for the coming decades. If we look at somewhere like China, there's a very different story. Right? In about 2015, there's this massive tipping point where we see this switch over from what was in the 1950s a very rural population, switching now towards a very urban population. And by 2050, 80% of the people in China will be in urban areas and 20% in the rural areas, according to this modeling. If we take a look at India, a similar story to China. It's just that this crossover is expected to occur closer to 2050. But you can see again this shift to urban areas away from the rural areas. If we look at Africa, so here we're looking at Nigeria, and Africa is where we're seeing a huge shift of people from rural to urban areas. That tipping point was in about 2018, where people have shifted to the cities, and that's a very common story for much of Africa. I thought for balance, it would be really important to find a map where the reverse was the case. And it took me some time, but Samoa has a largely rural population. Okay, so there are parts of the world, and a lot of the Pacific Islands fit this pattern where the majority of their population are rural, and they will probably remain rural for the coming decades. The point I'm trying to make here is most of the people of the world live in the city, and that's going to increase as we move towards 2050. Okay, so the people are moving to the cities. Urban agriculture, when you say that, people often think about people growing, a couple of carrots and tomatoes in their backyard or some parsley in a pot. It's actually quite an economically valuable sector as well. And so I became aware of these data just last week, or earlier this week, I should say. This is looking at Australia's food and agribusiness opportunity, and that it could be worth over $200 billion by 2030 in value added. Okay, the point I want you to take away from here is if we look at urban agriculture, it's currently valued at about $3 billion. Okay, that's a really big number, and shifting towards $5 billion by 2030 when you've got that value add in there. The point I'm trying to make is we are talking about billions of dollars here. And we can compare that to other sectors. Let's have a look down here. Technology in small farms, that's 0.3 up to $1 billion. Precision ag and big data, 0.3 up to $1 billion. It pales compared to, say, health awareness and targeted eating and things like that. But the point I'm trying to make is we are talking about a significant amount of money here on the scale of billions of dollars. Urban agriculture is also something that people undertake in times of stress. So we expect to see greater uptake of these sorts of practices when people are more concerned about their food supply. So during the First and Second World Wars, there was a lot of emphasis on growing your own food and these victory gardens, so-called victory gardens. Cuba has a massive urban farming enterprise. So there was a real revolution around changes in Cuba over recent years, and they've really become very self-sufficient in terms of their food production within their cities. And as you can see in this image here, we've got a low mid-rise apartment block here, and then we've got a farm, and that's supplying that community. And of course, with COVID-19, there's been a lot of interest in urban ag as well. This next figure comes from the World Economic Forum, and I always show this in my first year biology lectures because I think it really highlights the importance of agriculture and food. So what the World Economic Forum does every year or so is they look at the global risks landscape. Okay, so this is the most recent one. They think about what are the big risks that are facing the planet. And they think in terms of the likelihood of them occurring. So on the x-axis, as you go from a low likelihood to a high likelihood, and then the impact that that particular thing may have on the world. So from a low impact up to a high impact. And what you see in the top right-hand corner are things like climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, human-made environmental disasters, water crises, natural disasters. Agriculture and food and the supply of food sits at the heart of these issues. The things that are most likely to happen and going to have the biggest impact are associated in some part with agriculture and food. And so as we move into those kinds of scenarios, we're going to see greater increase in urban agriculture. So a lot of people talk about this in the context of climate resilience and adaptation, right? It helps people secure their food supply. One point that's really interesting here, and I'll just talk about this for a moment, infectious diseases. So they identified it as having a below average likelihood and a reasonably above average impact. Okay, so as we know, it's a big deal. What I would say here is the impact here is something that we're going to feel for the next few years to come. But when we think about it relative to, say, climate change and biodiversity loss, the impacts there are going to be generational. Okay, and so we're going to have really big impacts coming as we move forward, and really the impacts on the food supply. We need to look at the different options that are available to us. Okay, so let's get some data. Let's talk about some data. So urban agriculture, what I would say is that most of the literature really comes from what I'd call an advocacy standpoint. Okay, a lot of it starts from the premise that this is a really good thing. Okay, what we wanted to do was to ask some really fundamental questions and really challenge the viability of these systems. And so Matt, in his PhD, and he's coming towards the end of that, has done some really interesting work looking at soil health in urban agricultural systems. He's looked at contamination of those soils. He's looked at nutrient management. And then we've also started with Izzy to ask some questions about simply, is there enough land to produce a meaningful amount of food for urban agriculture? So if we look at some of Matt's recent work, this was a paper that he published in the Journal of Cleaner Production, which I'm pleased to say has a very healthy impact factor, looking at urban soil health. And so Matt went out to 10 or 11 community gardens across Adelaide, okay? And they are shown on this map here across the Adelaide region. There's a photograph of one here as well. And he looked at soil properties, soil health in these particular systems. And when we looked at these sites, he looked at the soil that's within the beds where the crops are produced, right, where people are growing their food. But we also looked at the soil in between those beds, because on some farms, the food is produced in raised beds. In other farms, it's produced from the soil that's at that given location. But there's also some literature to show, and this is an example that comes from New York City, where there's quite high levels of lead in the soil. And whilst people are using raised beds, because they're spending a lot of time exposed to that, they are actually getting exposure to that lead. So it's really important not only to look at the soil where the crops are being grown, but also the soil between the crops as well. So Matt went out to these sites, and this was done in winter. And so as you might expect, you'd find a lot of the allium type crops and cabbage and the sorts of crops you'd expect to see growing in winter in Adelaide is the dominant species, but reasonably high levels of diversity. So species richness of up to about 6 species within a given plot. And again, that might be, as you'd expect, that an individual farmer who has one plot, you don't just want to eat onions, right? You want to grow a range of different crops. Another thing that Matt's done is he's gone out to a number of the sites, a subset of the sites, and looked at them on a monthly basis as well, looked at changes in microbiomes and soil properties, but also the shifts in the crops that are being grown over that time. One of the really interesting figures here looks at the levels of metals in the soil. Okay, so some of these sites are on sites where before they were urban ag sites, they had industrial land use. And so one of the potential concerns is there a legacy of that industrial land use in terms of metals in the soil? And so what you can see here is looking at the metals in the soil that comes from the beds. So that's in the sort of reddish color. And then from the soil between the beds in the green and the blue at 2 different soil depths. The key take home here is that the metal concentration in soils were below national guideline levels for all samples. right? So that was some good news. But it was, however, higher in sites where there was previous industrial history. So there was a legacy of previous industry on those sites. But using raised beds with introduced soil eliminated those differences in previous land use history. So even if you have a site where you have an industrial history, by using the raised beds, that's one of the ways that people can try and overcome some of those sorts of legacy effects. Some similar work was recently done in Melbourne, and in that study they actually found that some sites had heavy metal concentrations that were in excess of the national guideline levels. All right, so this is a very real thing that people need to think about. Fortunately, the news for us was good from an Adelaide perspective. This next figure shows plant available phosphorus in the soils. And so we've got our 12 different sites on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we've got the Colwell P. Anyone who's measured a Colwell P will immediately know what I'm about to talk about here. These levels are very, very high. Okay, we're getting Colwell Ps up in the sort of 700 milligrams per kilogram range, some in excess of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. The blue line down here shows the sort of target level that you would go for a Colwell P for a vegetable crop. So what we're seeing here is very high levels of phosphorus. And we think that that's related to the types of nutrient sources that people are using. So a lot of composts are used, which aren't particularly high in phosphorus, but a lot of manure is used. Okay, and so in some gardens, they've got free access to horse manure from the racetrack in Morphettville, and that contains a lot of phosphorus. And so some of the work that Matt's been doing has been talking to the farmers about how to manage their phosphorus as well. We looked at nitrogen, and nitrogen levels were more in line with what you might expect for a vegetable farm. The other thing that Matt did was he looked at mycorrhizal colonization of the roots. So these are beneficial soil fungi that can help plants take up nutrients. Generally, we would expect them to be reduced under high levels of soil phosphorus, but we actually found reasonable levels of mycorrhizal colonization. And so this was a really nice story to take back to the gardens to say, here's a group of soil fungi that are beneficial. They're a nice indicator of healthy soil, and they are present in your soils. We also did some work where we added additional fungi and we saw an increase in colonization. But the point is these beneficial fungi are present in the soil. So the sort of main points to come out of that initial survey that Matt did was really around nutrient management, and that remains something of a challenge. And I think there's an important piece of work to be done to work with urban farmers to work out how to best manage their nutrients. And that's about the source of nutrients that they're using and the timing that they're applying those nutrients. I think there's also a role here for soil testing, and we have a proposal out there at the moment where, if successful, we'll be looking at soil samples from a couple of 100 different urban ag sites across Adelaide to try and look at baseline levels of nutrients and some other things as well. But I think soil testing is something to think about as well. As I said before, Matt's done some really nice work looking at the seasonal dynamics of the soil properties, the crops that are being grown, but also the soil microbiome and nutrient cycling as well. And some recent work looking at the performance of different types of growth media and some commercial inoculants. Okay, so that's sort of the biophysical side of the urban ag story. Excuse me. The other side is really asking some fairly fundamentally important questions about achieving self-sufficiency through urban agriculture. And so the idea here is urban agriculture a nice idea? Is that all it is? Or is it actually a plausible reality? And that's the central premise of Isabel's work. So she's asking the question, what are the provisioning capabilities of residential food gardens? Right? And the way that you answer that question is you first need to work out how much land is available to undertake urban agriculture. Right? If you don't have enough land available, well, then that presents a real challenge. So we need to ask that question. And the second part of that equation is really around how much food can be produced on an urban agricultural site. Okay, so what Isabel did is we took 3 regions in Adelaide, so Aldinga in the south, around the Burnside area in the centre, and Gawler in the north, and we collected or we assembled some imagery, so some satellite imagery and some LiDAR imagery, so we could undertake a remote sensing based approach to look at the land use in these 3 regions across Adelaide. So we have our different sets of imagery. And then a model was developed, and I'm not going to go through the details here other than to say we've got our spectral data and we've got our point cloud data. You bring this in, you train the computer to basically identify land that might potentially be available to urban agriculture. Perhaps a better way to describe that is to look at one of the outputs. So here in the top of the image, we've got a residential part of Adelaide. We've got the streets, obviously. We've got the houses. You can see the blocks here. And what you can see is all of the lawn. Okay, so what we decided was potentially available land, and we focused on privately held land. So we've got the cadastral data as well, so we know what's private and public. Land that's potentially available to urban agriculture might be people's backyard lawns. Okay, so that's an area that's currently got one land use, and we're saying, what if you were to grow vegetables on it instead of lawn? And so Isabel trained the computer up to identify lawn. And so here's an output from the model where you can see, let's take this house here, for example. There's a lawn in the backyard. There's a little bit of lawn out the front. And the computer is quite successfully, the model, I should say, is quite successfully identified the lawn. And again, we're focused on the private land here. We're not talking about the roadside verges or this public land here. And again, the model performs quite well. It's able to differentiate between the buildings and the lawn, but it's also able to differentiate between the lawn and the trees. And that's really important. We wanted to focus on areas that weren't shaded by trees. So it was important to really be able to identify the lawn. So now we have a map of lawn in Adelaide. What we then were able to do was to work out the area of lawn in each block. So create a frequency distribution looking at the amount of lawn available in each block across our three survey areas, so the central, the north, and the south. And so what the frequency distribution shows you is there are very few properties that have 1,000 square meters of lawn available. There are some with very small amounts of lawn. The median for the three regions falls in at around about 120 meters squared. Okay, and if you think about your own backyard, I think, you know, that kind of fits with what you might expect for backyards. And we get this skewed distribution. There are some very large blocks, there's some small ones, but the bulk of them sit around here at about 120 square meters. So now we know how much land is in lawn that could be converted into urban agriculture. What we then did is we sourced some data looking at production. How much food can you produce through urban agriculture? And so we tackled this in a couple of different ways. Initially, we had a data set from Sydney. Izzy recently found a data set from Adelaide. So a PhD student at UniSA did some work where she worked with urban gardeners and looked at the amount of food that they were producing over quite a long period of time, more than a year in some cases. So we've actually got some really good numbers around how much food is potentially produced by urban farmers in Adelaide. And we also source data on commercial yields of vegetable crops. So when we take our amount of land available and we know how much food can be produced, we can then calculate how much food you could potentially produce in each location, each backyard effectively. We then use that information to say, well, the average household size in Adelaide is about 2.5 people. And we know the number of serves of vegetables that each person needs per day. So we could then calculate the percentage of lawn that was required to supply the average household with its daily requirement of vegetables. Okay, I'll let that sink in for a moment. When you look at the commercial yields, you basically need to use around about 100% of the lawn that's available to achieve that. But when you look at the scenarios, and we looked at 3 different yield scenarios here, a low, a medium, and a high, and this is based on the actual data from urban agriculture sites in Adelaide. If you look at the, let's look at the medium scenario, sort of 70% of the land would need to be used to produce food. But in the high scenario, there's around about 20% of the land that would need to be put into urban agriculture to achieve that self-sufficiency. Now, obviously, there's going to be a massive gradient in people's ability to produce food, but the point is that there is plausibly enough land available to produce the food that people require. Another way of presenting that, so here we've got our same frequency distribution with our lawn areas, and then we've just colored here in the red color the portion of the curve that wouldn't be able to achieve self-sufficiency under the high, the medium, and the low yield scenarios, and also the commercial yield scenario. So for me, the take home here is it's a plausible thing. There's potentially enough land available for people to produce meaningful amounts of food. Whether or not it's all the vegetables that they require, that remains to be seen, but it's a significant proportion of that. Okay, so just to summarize that, remote sensing successfully identified lawn pixels as land available for urban ag. Under high yields, just about 20% of domestic lawn is required to meet vegetable intake. And I would argue that private lawn is valuable land for urban ag, offering self-sufficiency in part of the diet. Okay, this is a plausible thing. But that's just the first step in the story, right? Just because the land's there, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. Do people have the time? Do they have the skills? Do they have the motivation? I think in terms of motivation and time, in times of stress, we will start to see a greater shift towards this. Okay, skills, I think there's a lot of the skills associated with producing food in our own backyards have been lost in some ways, right? A lot of us know how to do it, but people don't produce their own food as much as they used to. And so I think there's an interesting education piece there. Land is only one part of the resource puzzle, right? You need water to produce crops and you need nutrients as well. And so the work that Isabel's now doing is looking at, we know how much water it takes to produce a lawn, we know how much nutrients it takes to produce a lawn, how much water would it take to produce the vegetables, how many nutrients would it take to produce the vegetables, and really trying to do a bit of an assessment of that in a spatially explicit way. I guess my key take-home message around the urban ag stuff is it's really to sell, I think, quite a compelling story that this is a good thing to do, but we need to move away from advocacy and we need to get some hard facts. And so to me, that's really where we're trying to focus our attention on trying to see whether or not this is a plausible option. Okay, so just to wrap up the seminar, a couple of conclusions. Farmers do more than producing food and fiber and fuel. They manage much of our landscape. They're stewards of much of the land that we have. And not only do they produce food, but they plant trees. They look after this vegetation. And so it's really important, I think, to think of agriculture in a much broader landscape scale and think about all of the services that agriculture provides. And it's more than just food and fiber and fuel. The other thing I'd say about farmers is they might live next door, right? Residential backyard urban agriculture is a viable source of food production. I was actually quite surprised the other day. I was driving down a local street and a house had been knocked down and they removed the fences. And what I could see out the back was a small vineyard, right? These people had 3 or 4 rows of about a dozen or so vines in a residential block in Adelaide, right? These kinds of things are going on all around Adelaide. So the farmer might just live next door. Okay. So next time I'll probably show more of these, but they might be from an environmental planting or from an urban agriculture system. The point I'm trying to make here is really, I think when we think about these processes down here at the very small and functional scale, it's really important to bring them back to the landscape scale. And that landscape isn't only agriculture for food, fuel and fiber, but for other services as well. So I will stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. I've got a couple questions already, but if anybody has any questions, can you please type them into the Q&A box? There is one question sitting on chat, so I'll ask that one first. That's from Aaron Sterling. Isn't offset carbon held in trees a significant fire risk? How can this be mitigated?
Great question. And firstly, hello, Aaron. It's great that you've been able to join the seminar. I'm really pleased to answer your question. And given that your PhD was around fire and carbon in soils, that's a good question. There is a fire risk, right? So if you've got carbon in trees, you run that risk. I also think about the litter layer as being it's an interesting pool of carbon. So you've got the tree biomass and the leaves fall down, they land on the soil surface, and eventually they decompose and make their way into the soil. When they sit there in that litter layer, they're at risk of being burnt, okay, and they can be lost. When a fire goes through, of course, as you know, there's different intensities of fires. And so, you know, you might lose some of the biomass, but it's only a really intense fire where you would lose the great majority of the biomass. So yeah, carbon offset in trees is potentially a fire risk, and there's some work to be done around managing that risk, and that's around where we place these things in the landscape and how we manage them as well. Annie Bond, who did a PhD in my group a few years ago as well, she looked at some of these particular issues and modeling recovery post-fire using the full CAM and ERF type modeling. But yeah, certainly fire is an important part of the puzzle.
Okay, I have a question from Eileen Scott. How are your group's findings on the benefits of carbon sequestration being communicated to the community, and what prospects do you see for increased uptake?
Yeah, no, thank you, Eileen. That's a great question. Yeah, look, absolutely. When we did the work for the Goiter Institute, there was some media attention around that, and so people picked up more on the co-benefits than the actual carbon itself. We've been doing some work looking at carbon sequestration in vineyards recently, and that's received a lot of attention as well. So Joe Marks and Tom Lyons have been involved in that work primarily. And so that's, yeah, we try and get the message out whenever and wherever we can. But yeah, uptake through the media and, you know, events like today's as well. I think that's really important. We also spend quite a bit of time talking to farmers about this, and we get quite a few approaches from people saying, I'm really interested in this, I want to do this, I don't know how to engage in the ERF. And in fact, next week we've got a workshop looking at carbon sequestration and how you value that. So thank you for the question.
Okay, a question from Nick Collins. Can we get higher sustained rates of carbon sequestration by harvesting trees for laminated products for building, biochar, etc.?
Okay, no, yeah, that's a good question as well. So one of the, I guess the sort of the central idea here is you plant a tree, it grows, eventually it dies, it decomposes, some of that carbon gets lost. What if you harvest some of that timber and then you build a table with it, or you build a building and then really lock that carbon away? So yeah, that's a well-recognized thing to do. And part of the ERF methodology talks around forestry as an activity. Biochar is an interesting one. I wouldn't advocate for growing the trees, chopping them down and making biochar, but in forestry, there's a lot of thinnings. Okay, so when they go through and they thin out the forests, you get waste biomass. Perhaps some of that could be used to produce things like biochar as well. The point about biochar is it's really important to use it where you produce it, right? Because it's effectively, you can produce it, but then if you drive it a very long distance, you use a lot of carbon to move it from one place to another. So again, biochar, it's got a really interesting life cycle assessment that needs to be thought through. But yeah, certainly that's a really good point. Thank you.
I've got another question on the chat. Did the survey of lawn consider the south-facing lawns which might be shaded?
We didn't look at aspect in the model, but yeah, no, that's a very good point. The challenge there will be around the productivity. Is there a difference in productivity if you're on the south side compared to the north side? I imagine you'd also, you know, I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but I imagine you'd also get into some really interesting challenges around irrigation as well, right? If you're on the warmer side, the northern side of the building, you may have a greater water requirement compared to, say, the southern side as well. But yeah, our model didn't get down to the level of aspect, but that's certainly an interesting point to consider. Thank you.
A question from Alan Binney. Have you considered looking at small-scale aquaponics setups?
That's something that we haven't looked at, but certainly there's a lot of talk about that, where people are, you know, looking at this in sort of indoor type scenarios as well. Green walls, rooftop. You know, one of the things about rooftop gardens is soil is really, really heavy, especially when it gets wet. So people are looking for different ways to produce food in those kinds of environments. The other thing I'd say sort of about aquaponic type systems is there's systems where people might produce fish, right, in some sort of tank, and then there's obviously waste material from that makes a really nice fertilizer that you can then use on a system. So I think, yeah, we haven't looked at the aquaponic side, but that's certainly an area that people do consider in the urban ag space.
A question from Jenny Aubrey. If we could regenerate open space areas in Adelaide, such as parklands, could we also achieve urban cooling benefits that could be quantified as co-benefits to carbon sequestration?
Yeah, I think, yes, that would be a co-benefit. Yeah, so urban cooling. So, you know, we all know the benefits that if you grow trees, you can get urban cooling, get away from that urban heat island effect. And so, yeah, that would be a potential co-benefit. And I'm sure you could put an economic value on that. People have done work looking at, you know, you lower the temperature in an area and that reduces the need to turn your air conditioner on, right? So that has an economic value there. The other thing I'd say around trees and urban areas is it can also increase land values as well. So there are a whole host of other economic sort of co-benefits that will accrue. And really, I think what we need to do at the moment is start to identify those, get a sound scientific basis for them, and then put a dollar value on them. That's really where I think the challenge lies.
A question from Annie McNeil. Where does peri-urban agriculture around Adelaide sit in terms of important components for food production systems in the state?
Great. Thank you, Annie, and thanks for coming along. Yeah, so peri-urban ag. So we've very much focused on urban agriculture, so within urban city limits. Peri-urban really lies at that interface between the urban and the rural areas. Look, it's an important part of the Adelaide region. If you look, on the Northern Adelaide Plains, for example, there's a lot of vegetable production. If you look down towards, say, McLaren Vale, there's obviously agricultural uptake and production at those particular locations. And yeah, it's a really important part of that system. I guess one of the challenges is as the city grows, as we start to encroach onto that land, there's going to be some significant challenges to be thought about as well. And there is some planning work that's been done to look at really protecting particular zones for agricultural production. So there are areas where you can't take, a vineyard and turn it into a housing estate.
And a question from Joe Marks. Did the survey examining particular carbon species in terms of viable sequestration modelling, i.e. what plant species are sequestering what carbon species, recalcitrant versus labile, or is it a matter of time?
Thank you, Joe. That's a great question, and it fits in very nicely with your PhD because you're doing something very similar in vineyards. The work we've done some work previously on environmental plantings, and we did look at different carbon species. So we used NMR to look at whether it was recalcitrant or labile carbon. And yeah, there were certainly some differences when you make that shift of going from a pasture where you're producing leafy green grasses and medics and things like that, and you go to big woody trees that are producing lots of cellulose and lignin, then you do see quite an interesting shift in the recalcitrance of that carbon. The ERF modelling doesn't really get down to that level of sophistication. It just looks at the total stock that gets sequestered.
Okay, and that is the final question that we have. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you very much, Tim, for presenting. And next week we have another soil-based webinar. This time Dr. Lynn McDonald from CSIRO will be speaking on resilient soil systems, targeting strategic deep tillage and organic amendments. So hopefully you can all attend next week. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.